Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340 Introduction to Public Policy and Management. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the foundational readings from Section 01, Public Policy and Administration Intellectual Foundations. We've gathered, well, a pretty fascinating stack of material here. It really unpacks how our understanding of government, democracy, public service, how all that has evolved. We'll be looking at excerpts from 4 key sources, and our mission today is really to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, sort of give you a shortcut to being well-informed on these crucial intellectual foundations.
Indeed. And it's a really rich collection of texts that allows us to, connect the dots from these historical assumptions about power all the way to the very modern challenges facing public administration today. It's, I think, an essential dive into the undercurrents shaping our current political and administrative landscape.
Okay, so first up, we have One Undemocratic Democracy by Bouie from the 1619 Project. This piece, wow, it really makes you think about how deep some historical assumptions about power have shaped American politics, suggesting this long-standing tension that maybe some people have always been seen as, well, more deserving of power than others.
And then we'll turn to 2 context matters: Authoritarian Populism and Public Administration Practice, Teaching, and Research by Richard C. Boggs. And this one provides a more contemporary lens, kind of exploring how those deeply rooted historical tendencies that Bouie discusses, how they seem to be resurfacing and directly impacting public service right now.
Right, and we're building on that with 3 Box Part 1, excerpts from Richard C. Boggs's Public Administration and Society, specifically chapters 1 and 2. This gives us a broad overview of what public administration actually is, helping us move beyond maybe simplistic views to a more nuanced understanding, thinking about its public character, its functions.
Exactly. And finally, we'll delve into excerpts from Dwight Waldo's The Enterprise of Public Administration and Woodrow Wilson's The Study of Administration. And these foundational works together, they offer a critical look at that inherent and often conflicting relationship between bureaucracy and democratic ideals. So yeah, get ready for some aha moments.
All right, let's dive in. To really ground our understanding, let's start with Richard Boggs in his work, Public Administration and Society. He challenges us to look beyond a simplistic view of government. He describes this common pastel, pink and blue perception. What exactly does he mean by that? And why is truly understanding it so critical for anyone involved in public service?
Well, yeah, Boggs is making a really powerful point there. He's saying that many people, maybe even folks working in government, often have a surprisingly superficial understanding. They might know scattered, seemingly unrelated facts, but they lack that deep grasp of governmental history, systems, structures, and how government works. So that pastel pink and blue view suggests this kind of naive, almost idealized image, right? Devoid of the complexity, the historical conflicts, the inherent power struggles that really define public administration.
Okay, so it's not just about being naive, it's actually harmful.
That's the crucial insight from Boggs, yes. A superficial view isn't just naive, it's actively detrimental. It can lead public servants to make decisions based on, just tradition or intuition, or maybe worse, simply pleasing those in power, instead of basing them on informed, meaningful analysis. And this reactive approach, well, it can lead to less effective policies and ultimately undermine the public good they're meant to serve.
That's a powerful indictment of just, well, not digging deeper. But wait, if public administration becomes too complex for the average person to grasp, doesn't that risk disengaging the very citizens it's meant to serve? How do we balance that need for deep understanding with, accessibility? And on that note, Boggs also gives us a framework, right? Distinguishing between instrumental versus contextual public administration.
Exactly. He introduces these 2 lenses to help us see the full scope.
Yeah.
So the instrumental view that sees public administration primarily as a neutral tool, like it's a tool used by elected representatives to accomplish public goals.
Yeah.
The focus here is on efficient execution, budgeting, managing personnel, delivering services like making sure Social Security checks go out on time. It's about the how-to, basically, how to efficiently achieve these predefined objectives.
Okay, mechanics.
Right. But the contextual view, that acknowledges something much broader, more dynamic. It emphasizes the sometimes difficult and conflictual process of identification of public purposes. Badly. So public employees aren't just value-neutral tools in this view. They're constantly interacting with citizens, with elected officials. They're adapting to new information, analyzing program results, responding to changing social conditions. They possess both detailed technical knowledge and considerable knowledge of social conditions and the needs of the population. And that means they influence policy, they tailor services in pretty profound ways.
That really clarifies the distinction. Okay, so it's like the difference between a chef just following a recipe, perfectly executing a fixed plan, versus a chef inventing new dishes on the fly. Based on what ingredients are available, they're to feedback the latest culinary trends. The contextual chef is constantly adapting, innovating, engaging with their environment to shape the outcome.
That's a perfect analogy.
Exactly.
And this leads us right into what truly sets public administration apart from, say, the private or nonprofit sectors. Box emphasizes this profound public character. It involves every person in a defined geographic area, and that creates unique dynamics. Crucially, participation in the public sector is mandatory and, well, coercively enforced. Think taxes or legal compliance. This isn't a voluntary choice like joining a private club or buying from a specific company.
That coercive aspect, that can sound quite negative, especially in a society that values individual liberties so highly.
It can, yeah. But you have to see it as the mechanism, the way a community collectively builds and maintains the society it desires. It funds everything from schools to roads to public safety. But you're right, this inherent power bestows a special responsibility on public service practitioners. They absolutely must be acutely sensitive to decision-making processes. They need to ensure openness to participation and carefully consider the impacts of policies on every individual's life.
Okay, that makes sense. A responsibility that comes with that power.
Precisely. And within this, Box distinguishes between two types of public interest. There's the aggregative public interest. That's basically just the sum of individual preferences, often gathered through voting or surveys. But the thing is, it can reflect short-term or maybe uninformed opinion. Then there's the substantive public interest. Now that's a more challenging concept that asks, what truly serves the public's long-term best interests? Ideally, informed by full information, thoughtful dialogue, deep consideration of future effects. It's much harder to achieve, obviously, but it's the ideal, kind of the North Star toward which democratic decision-making aspires.
And this unique public sector, it's not just ethically complex, it's also incredibly vast, just huge in scale. When you think about government, maybe you just picture, I don't know, the White House or Congress, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Oh, absolutely. The scope is staggering. Beyond the national government, Box notes, back in 2012, there were over 89,000 units of local government. School districts, cities, counties, special districts, townships. It's massive. We're talking millions and millions of employees across all these levels, national, state, local. Just K-12 education employed nearly 7 million people back in 2010. And they perform an incredible diversity of functions. A typical city alone, you've got public works, police, fire, libraries, parks, planning, building inspection, HR, legal, the list goes on. Plus, many services are shared across levels or contracted out, blurring those boundaries even more.
It sounds almost impossibly complex.
It is incredibly complex. But the common thread, despite this complexity, Box argues, is service to the public, to all the people in a defined place, and the responsibility that comes with it for sensitivity to societal values. And this immense, decentralized, multifaceted entity, simultaneously mandatory and coercive, yet striving for this substantive public interest, it really sets the stage. It frames the big challenge we're about to dig into, reconciling this necessary bureaucracy with our fundamental democratic ideals.
Okay, so given this incredibly complex and vast public sector, the fundamental question just hangs there. How does it actually function within a democracy? And this leads us directly to the core tension Dwight Waldo identifies in The Enterprise of Public Administration, a tension he provocatively calls, what was it? Irreconcilable, the clash between bureaucracy and democracy itself.
Yes, irreconcilable. And Waldo's use of that word really underscores the profound nature of this challenge. He sees bureaucracy and democracy not as, neatly aligned forces, but as two major contemporary forces.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they run parallel, sometimes they reinforce each other, and sometimes they just collide hard. They are, as he puts it, complex mixtures, ideas, emotions, philosophies, practices, institutions, all jumbled together. And to truly grasp public administration, Waldo insists we must grapple with this fundamental interplay. It's a constant dynamic shaping our governance at every single level.
Right. So to understand this collision, we first need a clearer picture of democracy itself. It's a term we use constantly, but like Waldo suggests, it's not some settled, agreed-upon thing. What does he mean by that?
Well, Waldo points out that while democracy fundamentally means rule by the people, the specifics are, well, they're far from clear. Who exactly are the people? How do they rule? What are the practical and principled limitations on their rule? There's no single, universally agreed-upon definition. Instead, there's what he calls a canon, according to different thinkers, Aristotle, Locke, Mill, etc., each offering distinct perspectives. And Box, in Public Administration and Society, reinforces this. He notes that back in the American founding era, democracy often carried negative connotations. It was associated with irrational mob rule. People then were actually more comfortable discussing things like liberty, republicanism, and civic virtue.
Interesting. So the word itself has shifted in meaning, or at least in its connotations.
Definitely. Today, Bach says, democracy expresses this widespread wish for individuals to be heard in and to participate in decision-making. And he gives us a couple of key distinctions in how we think about it now. First, there's procedural democracy versus substantive democracy. Procedural is all about the rules, equal rights, fair process, opportunity to participate. Substantive looks at the results, aiming for real equality and outcomes in people's actual situations. Then there's the how, representative democracy, where we elect people to decide for us, versus direct democracy, where citizens vote on issues personally, like ballot initiatives.
And where did Waldo land on this?
Waldo, for his part, preferred what he called a broad or substantive approach. For him, democracy meant a striving toward equality and freedom that extends beyond just the political stuff into economic and social realms, too. But he acknowledged this is difficult and dangerous terrain because, well, the meanings of liberty and equality are themselves complex and often conflict.
Okay, this discussion immediately brings us to those historical models of citizenship Bach explores. It sounds like these different ways of thinking about democracy and citizenship are really deeply ingrained.
Oh, absolutely. Bach sketches out three key historical approaches. First, the classical Republican ideal. This really championed community above all. It expected virtuous citizens to put the public good way ahead of personal advantage. Great for building strong communities, sure. But as history shows, it often came with a dark side. Often meant excluding anyone deemed different, usually out of a fear of mob rule or the tyranny of the majority.
Right, defining who counts as part of the community.
Exactly. Then, conversely, you have the classical liberal model. This places individual autonomy, freedom from church and state, right at the center. Its strength is prioritizing the individual. Think John Locke's life, liberty, and property. But the potential downside is allowing concentrations of wealth and power to effectively restrict democratic access for many. Finally, there's the radical democratic model. This envisions a much more egalitarian society. It advocates for curbing excess wealth, redistributing resources for social benefits like education, healthcare, that kind of thing. While it appeals strongly to fairness, it does imply pretty significant government control over private behavior.
And it's clear these aren't just abstract ideas from old books, right? They played out in real historical contexts.
Absolutely. Think ancient Athens, often held up as a model of classical republicanism with its active citizen participation in public debate. But critically, it excluded slaves, women, foreigners. The citizens were a relatively homogeneous group. Or look at the English Civil War in the 1640s. You had movements to enhance Parliament's power, classical Republican ideals there. But then you had the levelers advocating for individual rights, consent of the people, wider suffrage, a more classical liberal position. And even further out, the diggers, a radical fringe, advocating for redistribution of property, common land ownership, an early radical democratic experiment. These historical struggles vividly illustrate that persistent tension between individual liberty, collective good, and economic equality.
And these tensions were definitely alive during the American founding era.
Very much so. Bach points out the founders feared both monarchy and direct democracy. They were deeply concerned about the economy shifting from farming to manufacturing. And they worried about the potential for democracy to, as they saw it, spin out of control, this leveling spirit where the property of the wealthy could be confiscated. Events like Shays' Rebellion, where indebted farmers rebelled against creditors and state government, those illustrated deep divisions and really magnified fears of anarchy among the elite, strengthening the push for a stronger central government to protect property and maintain order.
Okay, this brings us directly and maybe uncomfortably to Undemocratic Democracy by Bouie from the 1619 Project. This article makes a really powerful, frankly unsettling argument. It suggests some of these deeply rooted historical tendencies led directly to undemocratic assumptions built into America from the get-go, and that they continue to resonate today.
Bouie's core thesis is indeed stark. He claims America holds on to an undemocratic assumption from its founding, that some people deserve more power than others. And he traces this directly back to the institution of slavery. He argues slavery didn't just produce goods like cotton, it produced ideas, elaborate beliefs constructed specifically to justify hierarchy. He points to South Carolina as a paradigmatic slave state, unquote. There, enslavers dominated politics, creating a government Bouie describes as the most undemocratic in the Union. They restricted office to wealthy property owners and gave disproportionate representation to the slave-rich districts, effectively embedding minority rule by the slaveholding class.
And John C. Calhoun emerges as a key figure in this narrative.
Absolutely. Calhoun, vice president, Secretary of State, senator, was a deep, fervent believer in slavery, not just as necessary, but as a positive good. Realizing, Bouie argues, that conventional democracy couldn't protect slavery, Calhoun set out to fundamentally limit democracy itself. He popularized nullification, the theory that states could just invalidate federal law they didn't like, and he advocated for a system of concurrent majority, which basically meant that all interests or portions of the community, and by that he meant the minority slaveholding South, would have an equal say, requiring full agreement to act, which is essentially a veto over majority action.
So redefining democracy to protect a specific minority interest.
Precisely. And Calhoun's definition of liberty wasn't universal. It was, in his words, a reward reserved for the intelligent, the patriotic, the virtuous, and deserving. Bouie argues this directly echoes contemporary arguments against expanding democracy, against trusting the majority. And Calhoun's ideas, Bouie claims, had a long, long legacy, even though he lost the terror fight and the South seceded years after his death. His suspicion of majoritarian democracy informed Southern sectional politics deep into the 20th century. Things like the filibuster were used explicitly as a tool to enact a kind of concurrent majority against civil rights legislation, like anti-lynching laws. Even after Brown v. Board of Education, segregationists explicitly used Calhoun's arguments. Bouie cites William F. Buckley Jr.'s 1957 defense of the white community's right to prevail, culturally and politically, even where they didn't numerically predominate because they were the advanced race.
Wow. That is a powerful and disturbing claim about historical continuity. It suggests this struggle over who truly constitutes the people, whose vote counts, whose voice matters. It's been baked in from the start in some ways.
It is. It highlights how deeply ingrained this idea that some deserve more power, or that certain groups just don't count as much, has been in American political thought and practice. And understanding this historical context, Bouie argues, is absolutely vital for understanding the enduring challenges to democratic governance we still face.
Okay, so with these historical tensions, swirling fear of mob rule, protection of property, debates about who counts as the people, how did the American founders actually try to structure government? How did they attempt to navigate these conflicts? Box, in Public Administration and Society, outlines several key structural features designed precisely to mitigate these fears and divisions.
That's right. The founders were definitely wary of unchecked monarchy on one side and wary of direct democracy or mob rule on the other. So they created a republican form of government. Power is technically vested in the citizens, but it's expressed through an elite group, representatives, acting for portions of the people. It was meant as a middle ground, aiming to avoid the irrationality or excesses of direct democracy. And that balance, well, we still debate it today with things like ballot measures.
Right, and then there's the vertical split.
Yes, federalism. That's the vertical structure. Powers allocated to both state governments and a national government. Initially, the founders were very protective of state powers, creating what's called dual federalism. Over time, those powers blurred quite a bit, and local governments became really significant partners in delivering services. But that fundamental debate over national versus state power, it continues to define countless policy battles. Think about federal grants influencing local services. And then there's the horizontal structure, the separation of powers, dividing government into legislative, executive, and judicial branches, with the legislative branch itself split into two houses. This was fundamentally designed to counter the abuse of power through a system of checks and balances.
And this structure, federalism, separation of powers, it's incredibly important for public administrators on the ground, isn't it? It directly impacts their daily work.
Oh, absolutely. This framework defines who administrators serve and for what purposes. They're constantly balancing often conflicting demands from elected officials in different branches or levels of government, from political appointees, and from the citizenry itself. This structure creates inherent ethical dilemmas for practitioners. Navigating competing loyalties, conflicting mandates, it's built into the system.
Which leads us right into that central concept in public administration, the politics-administration dichotomy, that relationship between elected officials and career public servants. And Woodrow Wilson's The Study of Administration is such a crucial early text here.
It really is foundational. Wilson, writing back in 1887, argued quite strongly for a separation. What was his vision? He envisioned politics as the realm of policymaking, deciding what government should do. Administration, then, was distinct. It was the detailed and systematic execution of public law, getting things done. But he didn't see administration as just dull, mere technical detail. He believed it was raised very far above that level by its greater principles, connecting it to lasting maxims of political wisdom, the permanent truths of political progress.
So he saw it as a noble pursuit, but separate from the messiness of politics.
Somewhat, yeah. He also emphasized that this emerging science of administration, that was largely developed in Europe for more centralized governments, needed to be Americanized. It had to be adapted to fit a complex and multiform state like the U.S., sensitive to public opinion and constitutional principles. But Wilson was also acutely aware of the challenges of popular sovereignty. He famously wrote, "It is harder for democracy to organize administration than for monarchy." Why? Because public opinion is slow, it's multifaceted, a score of differing opinions, it's influenced by prejudices. All that makes reform really difficult. He said, a truth must become not only plain but also commonplace before it will be seen by the people. A bit cynical maybe, but reflecting the difficulty.
So Wilson envisioned this clear split, this dichotomy, but his ideas, while hugely influential, were later challenged, right? As both Box and Waldo describe this neat separation, well, it did not exist in practice.
That's correct. The ideal of a strict dichotomy, a clean break between politics and administration, it proved pretty impractical almost immediately. The lines are constantly blurring in reality. Citizens, politicians, political appointees, they're often involved in the administrative side after a policy decision is made. And conversely, public service practitioners, the administrators, they frequently contribute crucial information and recommendations before policy decisions are formulated. Their expertise matters. Waldo points out that even early public administrationists like Wilson weren't really seeking a hermetic seal. They were deeply involved in political reform movements, like establishing civil service merit systems. They wanted a better relationship, not necessarily a total divorce.
Okay, so not a wall, but maybe clearer roles.
Perhaps. But the need for professional expertise inevitably led to administrative discretion. As Box puts it, it meant shifting some portion of the control over policymaking and implementation away from elected representatives to full-time career employees. And this naturally created tough questions about the allowable degree of administrative discretion. How much leeway should unelected officials have? And it raised fundamental questions about administrative legitimacy within the constitutional system. Who are they really accountable to? Waldo himself concluded, and this is key, no problem is more central to public administration than the relationship of politics and administration. It's a timeless, maybe unresolvable question. How much freedom should public service practitioners have? And ultimately, who do they answer to? Elected officials or the broader public?
And this is where it all comes crashing into our present day, isn't it? Richard C. Box's Context Matters piece paints this vivid, frankly quite concerning picture of a shift toward what he calls authoritarian populism and its direct impacts on public administration. It truly feels like these old tensions, politics versus administration, democracy versus hierarchy, are flaring up with a vengeance.
They absolutely are. Box describes the current context using strong language. A narrative of danger to the American constitutional order, marked by a perceived sense of danger to democracy. He characterizes this trend, authoritarian populism, as aiming in his analysis to restore the white dominant social stability of the 1950s, or perhaps even earlier periods. This governing style, Box states, is characterized by things like elite influence, but also public receptivity to authoritarian leadership styles. Critically, he notes the dissolution of facts into bizarre fantasies, a fading sense of shared public purpose, and increasing anti-government sentiment.
What does he see as the roots of this?
He argues it has historical roots in slavery and Jim Crow, harsh treatment or exclusion of Native Americans and immigrants, and discrimination against gays, women, and other groups. He defines authoritarian populism, drawing on others as involving a general predisposition to intolerance of difference and a revolt of the people against the elite and an underclass or scapegoat subpopulation. In its specific American version, which Box also refers to using the term white nationalism, he argues that white conservative Christians are often positioned as the normal neutral demographic, against which all other groups are viewed with suspicion or hostility. He also highlights the role of fear and delusion in this political style, diverting attention from actual societal conditions to imagined slights, dangers, and evils, supposedly coming from perceived enemies like coastal elites, people of color, immigrants, and so on. He even points to QAnon beliefs as an example.
And this links right back to Bouie, doesn't it? This idea of an undemocratic assumption that some people are more real Americans than others. It seems to be manifesting right here. Bouie argues that the destructive sectarian style of partisan politics we saw intensifying with the Tea Party era is directly connected to this fear of a changing demographic majority.
Exactly, you see that thread. What's fascinating and maybe disturbing is how Bowie's historical analysis directly informs Box's contemporary observations. Bowie posits that the Tea Party movement was fundamentally a reaction to an, quote, ascendant majority of black people, Latinos, Asian Americans, and liberal white people. Motivated, he argues, by fear and anxiety associated with the perception that real Americans are losing their country, end quote. And Bowie points to specific political actions taken, he argues, to nullify opponents. Quote, things like the 2011 debt ceiling standoff, Mitch McConnell's blocking of judicial nominations, including Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination, vote suppression laws targeting specific groups like the North Carolina law targeting African American voters with almost surgical precision, and even legislative power grabs in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin, where outgoing Republican legislatures stripped powers from newly elected Democratic governors.
He even quotes a Wisconsin speaker saying certain urban votes didn't represent the real Wisconsin.
Right. Implying that urban, liberal, and minority voters somehow don't count as much. Bowie connects all this attacks on the legitimacy of non-white political actors, the casting of rival political majorities as unrepresentative, the drive to nullify democratically elected governing coalitions. He argues these methods are clearly downstream, as he puts it, of a style of extreme political combat that came to fruition in the defense of human bondage. It's a really stark claim about historical continuity in political tactics aimed at limiting majority rule.
And this regressive context, as Box calls it, is not just theoretical. It has very real, tangible impacts across all levels of government, and even hits academia hard.
Indeed. Box provides some alarming examples. At the federal level, he points to former President Trump's open hostility toward career federal professionals, calling them the deep state, and the attempt to implement Schedule F, an executive order that aimed to remove civil service protections for potentially tens of thousands of federal employees, effectively threatening a return to a political spoils system where loyalty trumps expertise. Box even mentions Steve Bannon's stated goal of bringing in shock troops to deconstruct the administrative state.
And at the state level.
At the state level, Box highlights the focus on issues like voting access, LGBTQ+ rights, and especially education. Laws passed in states like Georgia, Florida, Idaho, Mississippi, limiting how teachers can discuss racism or history, often framed as preventing indoctrination. These directly impact teachers, school administrators, librarians, even university professors, and locally. Anti-government sentiment fuels recall efforts, sometimes based on misinformation. Threats of violence against public officials seem more common. And Box notes how bizarre fantasies can enter public debate. He mentions the debunked Nebraska story about schools providing litter boxes for students identifying as furries. It shows a breakdown in shared reality. He even cites a Texas mayor during a crisis basically saying, sink or swim, the city owes you nothing, reflecting a kind of harsh anti-collectivist sentiment.
That University of Florida case study Box details is particularly chilling, hitting closer to home for us in academia.
It is. Box describes it as Red State University blues. Elected officials imposing political views, using budget threats to scale back diversity programs, trying to sanitize history, interfering with appointments. The UF case involved the university initially denying professors permission to provide paid expert testimony in a voting rights lawsuit against the state because it was deemed adverse to the interests of the university, which relies on state funding. Later, other professors joined the lawsuit after being denied permission to testify in cases related to COVID-19 mask mandates. A faculty senate report found widespread self-censorship among faculty, fear of retaliation for expressing views unpopular with the state government. Then came Florida's Stop Woke Act, directly controlling course content, prohibiting teaching concepts like systemic racism or that meritocracy might be influenced by race. And perhaps most disturbing, the lawsuit alleged political abuse of the mental health system to persecute and discredit political opponents within the university. The report called it a feature of encroaching authoritarianism. It paints a really grim picture of political interference in academic freedom.
Okay, so given this really complex and frankly often troubling landscape, historical tensions, structural issues, contemporary populist pressures, what does it all mean for the future of public administration? How do we navigate these deep-seated challenges? We've heard Box talk about these recurring themes like the perennial call to run government like a business.
Right, that run government like a business idea. It pops up again and again since the 19th century, really. Driving things like the original civil service reforms, the council manager plan for cities, efforts to restructure the presidency. Efficiency is always presented as the primary value. But, as Box points out, efficiency can often conflict with other crucial public values, particularly social equity. His example: a job training program for low-income people might look inefficient on a simple cost-benefit analysis, but it fundamentally serves the value of equity. The council manager plan itself, created to bring business-like efficiency to cities, also had the effect of shifting power away from political machines, often supported by immigrants, towards professional managers, often preferred by business leaders. It shows how seemingly neutral structural changes aiming for efficiency can serve specific values or even class interests over others, like political responsiveness.
This leads us to think about broader societal shifts. Box talks about the postmodern era. It feels like a time of great uncertainty, maybe fragmentation.
It does feel that way. Box describes this postmodern era, though he uses the term cautiously, as a period where ideas about people and society that have been accepted as real for some time are coming apart. What does that look like? Well, diminishing trust in institutions like science and government to solve big social problems. Government often seen as serving special interests. More social fragmentation, people identifying less with traditional parties or institutions, more with specific communities of interest, maybe online ones, a sense of vanishing norms, uncertainty about the values underlying morality, sometimes leading to extreme views trying to impose a particular morality, a general skepticism about authoritative answers, questioning official histories, distrusting experts, sometimes a preference for the small and local, focusing on private, daily challenges rather than big public projects, and this paradox of globalization. Economic interconnectedness affecting local cultures, driving consumerism, but also sparking resistance.
That sounds a lot like today. Does Box see this as totally new?
Interestingly, no. While acknowledging today feels unique, he reminds us that change, uncertainty, and questioning of commonly accepted values can be found at many points in history. He references Walter Lippmann's 1914 book, Drift and Mastery, which reflected very similar sentiments back then, a feeling of being cut loose from the certainties of the past. So this feeling isn't entirely unprecedented. That perspective helps us understand that while our specific challenges are new, the experience of navigating profound societal shifts is a recurring human one.
So, pulling this all together, what does it mean for public service practitioners today? Waldo, Wilson, Box, they all seem to offer insights into what's needed in this kind of turbulent environment.
They do. Waldo, despite his irreconcilable tension, concludes that bureaucracy is ultimately necessary. There's simply no alternative to large-scale governmental organization and administration. It's instrumental to achieving many goods, even if it entails some bads. The perpetual challenge for him is to achieve an optimal mix of democracy and bureaucracy. He also discussed the new public administration movement from the late 60s and early 70s. That was a reaction to the social ferment of the time. It was critical of establishment practices and really focused on promoting social equity. Key themes were client-centered bureaucracy, more participation by both clients and employees, and representative bureaucracy, making sure the civil service reflected the diversity of the citizenry. These are all attempts, really, to extend democracy, weaving it into administration.
And Wilson, what's his enduring message?
Wilson, despite his early call for separation, recognized the immense difficulty of reform in a democracy. We must, he said, instruct and persuade a multitudinous monarch called public opinion. And that's a much less feasible undertaking than to influence a single monarch called a king. His takeaway was that reform is slow, it's incremental, it's inevitably full of compromises, a dose of realism.
And Box bringing it right up to the present with context matters.
Box brings it home with some pretty sobering implications for practice, teaching, and research right now. He sketches out a potential future scenario: a reduced and politicized federal civilian workforce, state governments actively shaping local, educational, and academic administration to fit an authoritarian populist agenda, and local governments increasingly constrained. He warns of a potential work environment where delusion, ignorance, and the threat of political violence become normalized, where facts, reality, and a shared sense of public purpose become unstable, where political neutrality is compromised. In academia, he worries that the subject matter taught in public administration classrooms might become narrower and more constrained, with intensified external oversight. Discussions about democratic governance, social equity, they can become relegated to insider talk of historical note, rather than central concerns. This all circles back to that core ethical dilemma Box raises in his other chapter: the role conflict between obeying elected leaders and maintaining professional standards and service to the broader public. How do practitioners navigate that when confronted by direct political interference and an erosion of established norms and facts?
It sounds incredibly challenging. Is there any note of optimism?
There is a glimmer. Box offers this powerful idea. Forewarned by a worst-case image of what could happen, we may find ways to influence people and events, working toward a more desirable future for public administration.
Hmm.
Knowing the risks might empower us to counteract them. And that enduring debate around the politics-administration dichotomy, the one Waldo called central to public administration, it remains vital. It forces us to continually ask, are the changes we see pushing us toward a more utopian democratic future, or potentially more authoritarian one? Understanding these foundations isn't just academic anymore. It seems absolutely crucial for actively shaping what comes next.
Wow. Okay. That was a truly eye-opening deep dive. We covered a lot of ground there. From the exclusionary practices in ancient Athens to John C. Calhoun's theories defending slavery through nullification, all the way to the contemporary challenges highlighted by things like Florida's Stop Work Act. It's just so clear that these tensions between democratic ideals and the practicalities of governing, between majority rule and minority rights, between expertise and political control, they are as old as the Republic itself, probably older.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating, or maybe sobering, is how the debates our founders grappled with. Who should govern? How should power be structured? What's the role of the individual versus the collective? These questions continue to echo so loudly in today's political landscape, especially as we navigate the rise of this authoritarian populism Box describes and see its direct impact on public service. It really underscores how deeply these historical assumptions and conflicts continue to influence contemporary challenges.
Yeah, it really does. And it truly highlights the immense responsibility, maybe even burden, on public administrators. It's not just about executing tasks efficiently, is it? It's about being informed, critically thinking individuals, people who understand the historical and societal context of their work, who
Yes.
recognize the ethical dilemmas they might face when those foundational principles are tested or attacked.
Absolutely. And as Dwight Waldo suggests, there's probably no easy final solution to reconciling bureaucracy with democracy. It's likely a permanent tension. But by constantly striving for that balance, striving for equality and freedom, as he put it, and by acknowledging the lessons of history, both the good and the bad, we can hopefully shape a more desirable future. It's about recognizing this tension is a permanent feature and that continuous informed effort is required to keep the system aligned as best we can with democratic values.
So, for you, our listener, maybe here's a final thought to mull over, something to take away from this deep dive. If this core problem, the tension between democracy and bureaucracy, between different values like efficiency and equity, if it pervades our society, as Waldo hinted, affecting private and public organizations alike, how might you, in whatever sphere of influence you have, whether it's work, community, or just as a citizen, how might you contribute to maximizing the utilities of democracy while navigating the necessities of bureaucracy? And what does that even mean for the very definition of good administration in our incredibly complex, often contentious, modern world? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the intellectual foundations of public policy and management. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep making a difference. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.